Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you from Ra'anana outside of Tel Aviv. This is episode 85 entitled Thanks and F You. And I guess I should start with a little disclaimer. Normally, I don't swear during my podcast. At least I think I don't. Although there have been a few times when it's occurred to me that maybe I do. And certainly in my comedy act, I don't. I'm a clean comedian, yet there's something about podcasting that I think brings out a real inner honesty on some of these issues I feel, and sometimes a four-letter word seems to be the only appropriate one. And I got to warn you, today might have one or a couple. And to my producer, editor, Adina, who's brilliant and who's doing this right now, listening, you might need to add that little E icon when you're uploading it. So warning to you as well. I gotta also apologize if the audio is not clear. I had a total meltdown of my MacBook computer this morning, just refused to open, and there's now a blinking message on the home screen that says, contact Apple support, contact Apple support. So I'm really improvising here with a new laptop, and I had to jigger up a different audio system than I usually use. I don't have my big expensive mic with me. So I do hope the audio is okay, and apologies if it's not. I also want to thank all of those who wrote in, who listened to last week's episode. Last week I didn't record an episode live, but I did drop an episode on iTunes and on Spotify this past Wednesday, and it's an interview with Jay Rosen, who is an activist in the LGBTQ community. And in honor of Pride Month, it's easy to forget that life goes on in so many ways, certainly around the world, but of course, here in Israel. And yeah, it's Pride Month here in Israel as well. Israel has one of the largest gay pride parades in the world. The Tel Aviv parade, I think, is the second biggest in Asia, only after Bangkok. And there are rainbow flags lining the streets of Ra'anana right now as we speak. And so I did an interview with Jay Rosen about the state of LGBTQ in Israel today, which is an issue that would be so easy to forget about with everything else going on. The government, Haredim, the war, hostages. But it's important we remember these aspects of daily life too, and especially the struggles. The LGBTQ community is still in many ways, they have a lot of rights, but also they are struggling and they still have a fight ahead. And I don't want to forget those kinds of fights just because there are larger ones, more popular ones going on. So if you haven't checked out that interview already, please do. Again, it's on Apple and Spotify. A lot to talk about this week. Before we get into the meat of the episode, I do want to tell you a little bit about what's on my mind. The big news over the past few days, one of the big news stories is that the government might actually collapse. A few days ago, we were almost certain that the government was going to collapse. And like I've spoken about many times in this podcast, it would ultimately not be an external force that would cause the government to fall, but internal tension, Jew on Jew. I don't want to use the word hatred, but we can say tension, fighting, challenges. The reason the government could collapse is because of a bill or non-bill that would force the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, to serve in the Israeli army along with all other Jewish citizens. And so far, Netanyahu has not managed to pass that kind of a bill. It could be that he knows that would be going too far, that when soldiers are literally dying this week, it would be just too much chutzpah to give yet another pass to the Haredi community. But what we are seeing is that the ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset and Shas, they are threatening to dissolve the Knesset, and that would bring down the Knesset. Netanyahu would no longer have a majority. So all I can say for now is stay tuned. We don't know where this is going, but that's a huge thing, that the government might collapse, because that would mean new elections and a new take on Gaza, a new take on hostage negotiations, a new take on the war. It would really change the landscape here in Israel completely. So that's, of course, one thing on my mind. And sadly, the other thing on my mind, like so many Israelis, is that we had 8 soldiers killed over the past 10 days in Gaza. There's much less certainty right now as to why we are in Gaza. There are certainly arguments for why we should be there, and that Hamas is really very close to being defeated, that they're already losing control of the population in Gaza, and that military pressure is ultimately the one thing that would bring Hamas down. But there's also a very good argument for why we should end the war and pull out the troops, and that would be to bring the remaining 20 living hostages home. And it's sort of hard to believe that at this point there are only 20 more alive left. But that is the number that we are hearing. And certainly one argument for bringing the troops out of Gaza would be to get those final hostages home. But what's going on in the background is that IDF soldiers, sadly, are continuing to be seriously injured and be killed. A few days ago, there was a building that was booby-trapped and collapsed on members of the Handasa Kravi, the combat engineers elite Yalom unit. They're the ones who seek out the tunnels and destroy them. They did all their normal checks. They sent in a dog, they sent in drones. They decided that this building was not booby-trapped, that it was clear to enter, but alas, once the troops were inside, the building exploded, came down upon them, 4 soldiers killed, and others seriously injured. And that's on my mind too, because we kind of thought that phase of the war was over. It seemed for a long time that the war wasn't being fought at all, and that we were really heading just to the negotiation stage. I mean, there were weeks at a time, perhaps even months, where we didn't read about a single death of a soldier in Gaza. And now to have 8 in one 10-day period, it's gut-wrenching, and again, it brings us right back to that very mournful place that sadly we're all familiar with here in Israel. So those are 2 things that are on my mind right now. And strangely enough, that topic actually does relate to the main subject of today's episode, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, I do want to address a couple of questions that came in over the past week. There were many questions that came in. I had to choose only 2 for the sake of time. This one came from Elaine, and it sort of started out with admonishing me for not answering it yet. Apparently, this has been sitting in my inbox for a while. So, Elaine, I'm sorry it took me so long to get to it. But nevertheless, I finally am. And maybe I was avoiding it psychologically because it's such a complicated question. Elaine writes, is it realistic to think that Hamas will ever release all the hostages, no matter what Israel does? Is it worth the risk of full withdrawal and ending the war? And she goes on to say that she believes that, unfortunately, she does not think so. That even if Israel withdraws from Gaza, she doesn't think Hamas would give up its only leverage. And you have a very good point, Elaine. At this point, the hostages, they are the one piece of leverage that Hamas has. So you can understand why it would behoove them or be in their interest to keep holding on to those hostages as long as possible. I don't agree with you, though, that it would never happen, that they would give up the hostages. I think if Israel were to agree to a full and complete withdrawal from Gaza, no more IDF soldiers in Gaza, and some sort of a long-term ceasefire agreement, which we can all agree the purpose of that from Hamas's point of view would be so that Hamas can rebuild and grow. In that sort of scenario, I could see Hamas releasing the hostages, especially because there would be international pressure if that kind of a deal were signed. But I don't see Israel doing that. I think to do that would be to acknowledge that we are leaving Hamas in power. And that's why this is such a tough question, especially with, I don't want to use the word only, but I am going to use the word only, especially with only 20 living hostages in Gaza. We have to ask ourselves, is it worth the risk of leaving Hamas in power just to bring back these 20 living hostages? And the bodies as well. Those are important, the bodies of the hostages who've been killed. But what we're really focusing on are the living hostages. What does it mean that this past week, 8 soldiers were killed in Gaza. That's 40% of the number of living hostages in Gaza. Does it maybe make sense at this point to sacrifice those 20 and do all we can to wipe out Hamas so that they can't kidnap again and get more leverage over Israel again? I'm really torn on this. There is a strong part of me that thinks we should end the war and get the hostages home because we have an obligation to. Because what do we stand for as a country if we don't bring them home? What are we saying to our soldiers who go into Gaza? That if they're captured, we will not do everything we can to rescue you? Are we telling Israeli citizens that you count as Israeli citizens as long as you're inside Israel proper, but if you're in Gaza, taken captive, we ignore you? We can't possibly send that message to Israel, Israelis around the world, and to the Israelis living here, and to Jews around the world, frankly. It's just not what we stand for. So even disregarding the number 20 living hostages, it's more about the ethos of who we are and standing up for that. And now the other argument, of course, is that we have to wipe out Hamas. There is no way we can leave Hamas in power. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of Israelis who, on the one hand, are saying out loud that they want the war to end, we need to bring the hostages home, but that deep down, there's a part of them that thinks we need to keep fighting this war until Hamas has been completely crippled. I'll admit it. I kind of put myself a little bit in that camp. If you were to ask me what's my opinion, I would say end the war, bring the hostages home because of what I said before, the ethos, the idea that what do we stand for if we do not do that? But I won't lie to you. There is that part of me that thinks we need to keep on fighting and we need to destroy Gaza completely and make it uninhabitable so that this kind of threat to Israel in the long term can't exist in the future. I wish it weren't that complicated, and I wish I didn't have to admit that to you, but I just did. Elaine has a second part of the question, which is, Joel, so often you make a point that is contradictory, that on the one hand, the majority of Israelis despise Netanyahu, mostly because they think he's prolonging the war to maintain his power, that he's a bully, etc. But on the other hand, you've said that if there were an election today, Netanyahu would probably win. How can that be? So yeah, I realize that that sounds like a contradiction. And in fairness to myself, the host of this podcast, I have always said that this is a complete contradiction, that 70+% of Israelis say that they believe Netanyahu is carrying on the war for political reasons, for personal gain, to stay in power. And yet, poll after poll shows that when people are asked who do they think is most fit to be prime minister, there's only one politician who gets a higher percentage than Netanyahu, and that's Ra'anana resident Naftali Bennett, who has filed official paperwork to be a candidate in any upcoming election, by the way. I don't think this says as much about Netanyahu and trust in him as it does in the fact that we really lack future leadership here in Israel, or at least we feel like we don't have a good option for an alternative. I think people would elect a different prime minister if they felt that they had a strong candidate, someone who spoke to them, someone who believes in them and that they believe in. But we just don't see that person. The opposition leader, Yair Lapid, has been an ineffective wet rag for the past, well, for as long as Netanyahu has been in power, since this past term. I mean, October 7th happened, the greatest tragedy to befall the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and the opposition leader has not done anything to be able to remove this leader from power. He's ineffective. And he also panders. He'll take points of view that don't seem to be in the country's interest. He'll take them merely to contradict Netanyahu, which I see as no better than what Netanyahu is doing. You've got Benny Gantz, who just doesn't have charisma and whose time has come and passed. There maybe are a handful of others, but no one really sexy, no one who really ignites enthusiasm and hope and change. And then there's Naftali Bennett. So he is the one candidate who, by a small margin, could be the one that people would select. So, yeah, I know this seems like a contradiction, but the reason the contradiction exists is not because at the end of the day we have this affinity for Netanyahu. It's because I really believe we don't feel that we have any other alternative. All right, we're going to get to the. Oh, we have one more question. So this question is from Stephen, and it's actually very apropos to today's episode. He writes, Joel, your pronunciation of Ra'anana is different than our friends and family in Israel use. These are native-born and Olim Israelis. Although it is spelled the way you say it, generally I hear Israelis say it differently. Ranana, one syllable less. What is the correct pronunciation? Yeah, I never really thought about this until you brought it up, Stephen. I say Ra'anana, but I hear both native and Olim Israelis say Ranana. To me, that isn't the authentic way, although I guess it's legit if people are saying it. But yeah, the correct spelling is Resh Ain. So Ra'anana. That to me is the correct way to say the name of my town. And the one we're going to be talking about today when we come back for the meat of today's episode. Thanks and F you. I'll be back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana. And again, today's episode is called Thanks and F You. And the genesis of today's story is that I had a conversation with a friend of mine from college about 10 days ago. He told me he's coming here for the summer, not for the summer. He's coming here later on in the summer for about 10 days, and it'd be great to get together. I said, yeah, you should come over for dinner to our place. He said, or you can come over to our place. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he told me that he and his wife just bought an apartment in Ra'anana. And I should give you some background. This guy is a lawyer in Los Angeles. Um, his wife, I believe, works in corporate law as well. And I know what my response was supposed to be. My response was supposed to be, wow, that's great. Mazel tov on buying a place here in Ra'anana. You're part of the Jewish homeland. But I'll tell you what my actual feeling was. My actual feeling when he told me this was anger and frustration. And I'll tell you why. There is a huge housing shortage in all of Israel right now, and especially here in the center of Israel. Tel Aviv, Kfar Saba, Herzliya, Ra'anana. There's limited space. Part of this has to do with the fact that it's a small country and there's only so many places you can build. Part of it has to do with this big earthquake that we're expecting in anywhere between 10 and 100 years. And so a lot of buildings are being knocked down so that they can be fortified to be strong against this upcoming earthquake. So we really don't have as many apartments and houses available as we used to in the center of the country, and really in all of Israel in general. And that's made the cost of housing explode astronomically. It is so expensive to live in Israel right now. I mean, it's always expensive to live in Israel, but right now, especially because of rents and the cost to buy a place in the center of the country, it's become unaffordable for many Israelis. There used to be a tradition in Israel where kids would go to the army, then they'd go to university, then they'd get married, and When they got married, the parents of the two people, the young couple, would chip in and buy the young couple an apartment to get them started. That tradition is no longer feasible in Israel. It's simply impossible. And I'll tell you this, forget the fact that maybe you're two school teachers married to each other and working. If you're two high-tech workers married to each other and working, you will not be able to put aside enough money to buy a family-sized apartment anywhere in central Israel. It's just not possible. And one of the reasons that housing is so expensive, aside from the ones I've told you so far, is that you've had a glut of foreigners, foreign Jews coming in and buying up apartments that they don't even live in. These apartments sit empty for 40, 45, 50 weeks out of the year. Sometimes they're turned into Airbnbs, or sometimes they are literally empty until the family will come over to Israel for Hanukkah, for Passover, for a few weeks in the summer. And there's this notion among foreign Jews that buying an apartment in Israel, it gives them a stake in Israel's future, and that they're supporting Israel maybe because they're paying taxes or just because they own a place here. And someone's got to look them in the face and tell them, when you buy a place here, but you don't actually live here, you are screwing over those who do live here. Let there be no mistake about it. One of the most touching stories from October 7th was how on October 8th, 9th, 10th, you might have heard this story. Israelis were flying back to Israel. Young Israeli boys were flying back to Israel to rejoin their army units. And there was this man, supposedly an Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox man, standing at the El Al ticket counter, and he would simply swipe his credit card for every Israeli kid, 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old, as he was purchasing a ticket to fly back to Israel to do his Miluim reserve service after October 7th. And we all thought it was such a great story that here was this guy just selflessly swiping his credit card so that these young boys could fly back to Israel for free in order to defend the homeland. And I have always thought that story is complete and utter bullshit. Not that the story didn't happen. It did happen. But the idea that we're holding this up as the symbol of Jews all being together, of Jews coming together and supporting each other, and of foreign Jews supporting Israel, you're totally missing what actually happened in this story. This is a case of an American Jew supporting Israel from a safe distance, supporting Israel with his credit card, so that other Israelis who've already served 3 years in the army, who already put their lives on the line for the army, could return to Israel and put their lives on the line for the army again. How does anyone else not see that this is what the story is actually about? It's about what sacrifice means. And to me, this is what I see as a huge difference between Israelis and Jews elsewhere around the world. Israelis will sacrifice, especially when it hurts. I think Jews elsewhere will sacrifice until it hurts. In America, synagogues, JCCs, other Jewish institutions, they have the names of families on every room. The Goldberg Sanctuary, the Cohen Social Hall. I'm telling you, the money that these people give to fund the social hall and the sanctuary and the rabbi study, it doesn't affect these families. They're giving this money because it doesn't hurt them to give it. Israelis will give even when it hurts. And believe me, I'm not trying to critique you, the listeners. I think that by virtue of being so involved in Israel, you are not the majority that I am talking about. But for so many American Jews, it's credit card Zionism. It's supporting Israel from a safe distance with a swipe of a credit card. And it relates to buying a place in Ra'anana as well. I wish these people who are buying apartments in Tel Aviv and Herzliya and Kfar Saba and Ra'anana and all these places, and Netanya, the number of French who own apartments in Netanya that are sitting open, waiting for the French to either move here eventually or for their vacation time. It's emblematic of what I'm talking about. They should think first, what is the impact of their buying an apartment? This is now one more apartment that an Israeli cannot rent or buy him or herself. You know, I had coffee today with Jacob. I don't know if you remember Jacob, but I did an episode about 8 months ago, 6 months ago, called Where Do Soldiers Poo in Gaza? And it was a really gritty, no holds barred conversation about what it's like to be a soldier in Gaza day to day. Where do you go to the bathroom? Where do you sleep? How many hours do you sleep? I wasn't asking about tunnels and missions, but really the logistics, like what it's like to exist as a human being in Gaza. And I had coffee today with Jacob just to catch up. And he told me that he and his girlfriend, eventual fiance, eventual wife, Bisha Tova, are looking right now for a new apartment because their current apartment is owned by their entire building is owned by a guy, a Jew, in Beverly Hills, and his family is coming to Israel for the summer. And so he's evicting everyone out of the apartment building, 5 floors worth of apartments, so that his extended family can have the building to themselves for the summer. And so now Jacob is looking for a new place, and he's telling me how astronomical the rents are in Tel Aviv right now. And I'm telling you, aside from the Tama program where we're strengthening buildings because of the earthquake, and aside from just the limited space, one of the big reasons is that so many of these apartments in the center have been bought up by quote unquote Zionists around the world who want their little piece of Israel safe and sound waiting for them. But meanwhile, they're taking real estate out of the hands of the people who live here. I'm thinking of Jacob. I'm thinking of all these other guys and gals who spent 2, 3 years in the army, into out of Gaza several times, 200 plus days of military reserve service. They're college, they're in university, but the university has been delayed a year. So now their whole career is 1 year behind because they missed a year of studies because of all the reserves duty service they're doing. And when they get out, and they get married, or even before they get married, they just want to rent a place. After all they've given to Israel, you're telling me they can't afford to rent an apartment because a lawyer in Los Angeles wants that apartment for himself? I'm sorry. To me, this strikes me as just utterly selfish and completely anti-Zionist, if you want to know my true feeling. So while I appreciate the support for Israel, it's not actually support. Buying a place when you don't live here is not supporting Israel. It's robbing the people who do live here of an opportunity to have an affordable life. Which is why, although I said to my friend, wow, that's amazing. What I was really saying in my head after he told me that he just bought this apartment was thanks and F you. Now, I got to also tell you that this is pretty much the worst type of marketing one could do. You know, my whole audience in the US is the Jewish world. So, what could be smarter than publicly chastising one's audience? But that's really not what I'm trying to do. You need to understand what I'm trying to do here and what the mission of this podcast is overall. The mission of this podcast is to open up readers' ear, open up listeners' ears to the realities of life here. It's not about Israel. This podcast is not about Israel. My most recent book, Israel 201, is not about Israel. It's about Israelis. It's about what it means to be Israeli, and it's about Israeli-ness and the ethos of Israeliness, which is a very special ethos. And it's the one that keeps me and so many other people here. And I was talking with Jacob about his future because he's at a crossroads too. He's thinking about, it's occurred to him, he said, to move back to the US where it's so much more affordable and where the job he's doing here, working at a tech company, would have twice the salary if he were to move back. But what he ultimately told me was that he can't see himself doing that because there's something special here. There's something about being connected to a bigger story. There's something about being connected to other people and to raising your kids here. He wants to raise his kids in Israel. This is Jacob, who served in an elite combat unit, who already went to Gaza and who told me that he's going back to Gaza in a month for 2 or 3 more months. And I know his mom listens to this podcast, so if you didn't know that, well, I'm sorry to break it to you, but text Jacob tonight and get the full skinny. So here's a guy who's already given so much to the country and is about to give again. Do we really want to take his chance to build a life here out of his hands? Of course not. So I just wish that people would think about that before snapping up these apartments and houses that are so easy for them to purchase from afar, and meanwhile really make it difficult for the Israelis who live here day to day to build any kind of solid economic future. That wraps it up for today's episode of Inside Israel. Our next live broadcast will be on Sunday, June 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You know how to get in touch with me in the interim. The easiest way, just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's also where you can sign up for my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, it's just a weekly newsletter that goes out every Thursday, introducing you to the magic of Hebrew words and how Hebrew can really make our lives better and teach us how to be happier, more fulfilled human beings. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I'd love to hear from you if you have a question. I'm Joel Chasnoff signing off from Ra'anana. Lehitraot.